feel is a positive means to deal with conflict. And I hope you'll find it useful. I hope you'll find some ideas here that resonate with you. We admire your efforts through many years, even generations, to deal with the hard subjects, to come to terms, to find ways, to open doors. And we want to join you more and more in that effort. So if my system works here, I'll have a few slides. Could we close these front drapes again? Chairman Russell, I'm sorry I'm going to cut off your view again. I know you came for the view. But we'll open it again, all of them, to give you a better experience when we wrap up. You know well that we face increasing polarization in our world on a broad number of topics, and one of those that seems to be the most perplexing and polarizing is how to deal with conflicting claims of religious liberty and LGBT rights. For the past several years, our church has advocated an approach to resolving these conflicts that we refer to as fairness for all. In this presentation, I'll attempt to explain some of our thinking about how to preserve core religious freedoms while supporting important rights for LGBT persons who feel threatened and marginalized and often are. Ahmed, how do I advance this? I see a back arrow, but I don't see a front arrow. Okay. That's why we keep him around. Conflicts between people with different beliefs about religion and sexuality, these conflicts too often become destructive. They're generating hostilities and tearing at the fabric of our society. They threaten both religious and LGBT rights. Too often, religious people resist any effort to extend even basic civil rights to LGBT persons. A few of them refer to LGBT individuals as godless or evil, and too often some LGBT advocates seek to influence individuals who have a traditional understanding of marriage and family, gender, and sexuality. Both sides fear losing legitimacy and influence. Yet ironically, both sides want many of the same things. Affirmation of their basic dignity as individuals and communities, social respect for who they are, freedom to live their lives according to the dictates of conscience, and social and legal equality. These are the core interests animating both religious believers on the one hand, LGBT persons on the other. The difficult question is how can people and groups with such profoundly different views and interests live together in peace? The answer is an old one that has served this country well for centuries: pluralism. A robust pluralism is still the best model for reasonably accommodating everyone's needs in a diverse society. We believe that everyone should be respected for who they are and afforded the freedom to live openly and with dignity according to their core beliefs, whether religious or secular. Let's spend a moment on what might be called core religious beliefs. First, religious rights of individuals, and then institutions. First is the right of individuals to believe and worship and express their faith openly, and do it in conjunction with fellow believers without fear of retaliation or ostracism. We feel religion is not just about an individual's right to believe, It is their ability to act on their beliefs, to live openly according to religious beliefs, to exercise religion, and to have it to be the center of your life, as it is for many, if not all of us. It includes the rights of parents to pass on their faith to their children and to guide their education. It also means no blacklisting in particular occupations or profession because of religious beliefs. In other words, believing Mormons or Baptists or Catholics or Jews and so forth should not be excluded from any occupation or profession based on their religion. Likewise, there should be no religious discrimination in employment or housing and the traditional places of public accommodation. This expands, of course, to organizations. First is the right to form religious organizations and schools where believers can express and live their faith. It includes churches, synagogues, mosques, church-sponsored colleges like BYU or Tougaloo. I found that I was online looking this up the other day, and I saw that Tougaloo is ranked #1 among historically black Christian universities and colleges. Is that right? Yeah, he's not sure. #1, it was there in black and white. Well, for tens of millions of Americans, and certainly for our church members, religious freedom would be meaningless without the right to gather with fellow believers and to establish self-governing religious organizations. From the beginning of this nation, religious organizations have also had the right to establish their doctrines, their ceremonies, their requirements for membership, ecclesiastical office, employment, all without interference from the government, and an area the government simply has no business regulating. Finally, religious organizations have the right to speak out on public issues and participate in the public square on equal terms with other individuals and other organizations. Now, of course, LGBT persons have core rights as well, and they include protection for constitutional rights to speak out, to petition the government, to assemble, to interact, all without fear of reprisal. Live the lifestyle they choose openly without fear of retaliation or ostracism. And no blacklisting in particular occupations or professions because of sexual orientation. No discrimination in employment, housing, and traditional places of public accommodation. Right to establish businesses and organizations that serve LGBT individuals and advance their causes. And the right to speak out on public issues and otherwise participate in the public square. But what about when these rights conflict? What happens when assertions of religious rights and LGBT rights clash? It is inevitable that such conflicts will arise, but it is imperative that we not tear society apart with zero-sum approaches when these conflicts surface. So what is the best way to address conflicts so that both sides can live in peace and dignity with each other, as we believe Jesus Christ wants us to do? This is where the fairness for all approach that we have been promoting is especially important. When addressing conflicts between religious and LGBT interests, and I would say any other kinds of conflicts, it begins with a strong commitment to 3 principles. First, neither side should face an existential threat to its core rights and interests. This means each side should do everything possible to avoid conflicts that the other side has to win in order to survive. Because in such conflicts, there's little or no room for compromise. For example, the ability of religious organizations to select their ecclesiastical leaders is so vital to the very existence of a church that, as the United States Supreme Court has ruled, non-discrimination laws simply cannot interfere. The second principle is closely related to the first. From the outset, each side should affirmatively recognize that the other side is entitled to protection for its core freedoms and interests. This places negotiations on a secure and positive footing. It starts to build the trust necessary to reach reasonable compromises. And third, both sides should be realistic and sensible about what is a core right or interest. Not everything each side wants or feels strongly about is truly core. There needs to be realism and common sense. Once there is a reasonably clear understanding of what constitutes core religious freedoms and core LGBT rights, what hopefully emerges is a zone of compromise, where each side may have strong feelings about its interests, but because it is outside the core, we have an area of give and take, where sensible trade-offs and reasonable accommodations can be made in the interest of fairness, common sense, and peace. In our conversation yesterday with Church President Russell M. Nelson and his counselors, President Derek Johnson, wisely observed that even when we disagree fundamentally about an issue, it's almost always true that we're still in agreement on 85% of things. And this is a foundation on which we can work on the other 15%. I hope you let me quote you often in that regard. That's not to say that negotiations in this zone of compromise will be easy, or that there are always obvious solutions. Resolving these conflicts requires skill and determination and patience. It requires both sides to build relationships of trust and respect and goodwill. For too long, people on both sides of issues of the cultural divide have failed just to sit down and talk with each other and reaffirm their common bond as children of God. It also requires that we seek practical solutions that preserve the ability of both sides to live according to their core convictions while being reasonably accommodated in other areas. That means avoiding ideological purity, searching for reasonable and creative alternatives to secure each side's interest. With creativity and goodwill, there usually are ways to reach a compromise, if both sides are willing to be reasonable and give a little. Finally, resolutions with the flexibility to balance competing interests are often better than rigid standards or rigid legal rules that don't account for the great variability in circumstances. We hasten to add that this approach does not mean there won't be passionate debates and long negotiation as people of goodwill strive to reach sustainable agreements. It won't be easy, but experience has shown that good people can make it happen. In 2015, the Utah State Legislature adopted a landmark bill that is a good example of how these fairness for all principles work in practice. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was heavily involved in reaching a path-breaking win-win agreement with the LGBT community here in Utah. What many don't know is that representatives of the church and LGBT community representatives spent years getting to know each other and building relationships of trust. Ultimately, months of tough but friendly negotiation culminated in a law that protects both LGBT rights in employment and housing, as well as religious rights, helping ensure fairness for all. In the end, the outpouring of goodwill and the breaking of destructive barriers was just as important as the legislation itself. It was truly an unprecedented moment, with advocates on both sides cheering and weeping with a renewed sense of community and our common humanity. Lastly, these efforts require true moral leadership. One of my colleagues in the Quorum of the 12, Elder Jeffrey R. Holland, made this point in 2015 during the announcement of the church's support for Utah's Fairness for All legislation. He said, "Accommodating the rights of all people, including their religious rights, requires wisdom and judgment, compassion and fairness. Politically, it certainly requires dedication to the highest level of statesmanship. Nothing is achieved if either side resorts to bullying, political point scoring, or accusations of bigotry. These are serious issues, and they require serious minds engaged in thoughtful, courteous discourse." That is a weighty charge, to be sure. But one thing I deeply appreciate about NAACP is that you are serious people of a serious mind and committed to those moral standards. It is that moral leadership that you have provided and which you continue to pursue today that makes all the difference. Thank you.